The question I've been asked the most often is, when are we going back to work? Right? When are we going back to the office? When are we going back to normal? And I think by now, over a year into this great work from home or work from anywhere experiment, it's pretty obvious that the answer is we're not. At least not all of us, and not all of the time. You don't send hundreds of millions of people and everybody on this call to a much more flexible work arrangement for a year, to get used to that for a year, and then just expect everybody to go back to the way things were. And so the future of work, the future of how we're going to lead our own chapters, our own associations, is working from anywhere. Whether you're a team of 15 or 20, or whether you're a team of one, we're headed for a blending between what used to be this office life and home life like never before. And smart leaders are getting prepared for it. They're learning how to lead from anywhere. And I can say this because of two statistics or two ideas that I want to put in your mind before we dive into how to lead from anywhere. And that is that even before the pandemic began, February 2020, which, okay, technically it started a little bit before that, but the research was conducted in 2019. In February 2020, when most of us in the United States just figured this wasn't going to affect us, the Gallup put out their annual State of the American Workplace survey. And they showed that the most engaged employees, the most engaged workers across all sectors, for-profit, nonprofit, government, etc., were most engaged when they reported being out of the office 40 to 60% of the time. 40 to 60% of them, 2 or 3 days a week. So even before we all engaged in this grand experiment, there were people saying, you know, I want a little bit more flexibility. I work better when I have a little bit more flexibility. And the other thing that I think has been interesting is an ongoing trend to put together cross-functional teams and teams from across geographies. And actually, I'm speaking to the 1 or 2 person chapters on this because you know what it's like to put together teams of volunteers. That's what a lot of people who benefit from a large staff are just now getting used to. That if you have people who are working from just about anywhere, you can pull together a team based on who's best for the project, not specific to who is in and around the office or who is near you. And so if you're going to do that, you really can put a team together from anywhere. So today I want to share with you a couple ideas on how we can do that, how we can unlock that power and performance of remote teams, teams that work together from anywhere. And by the way, when I say team here, I mean people focused on a project. I don't necessarily mean just employees in an organization. You know, especially in the sector that we're in, you know that teams form around all sorts of different boundary lines, but it's people focused on a project that matters. And I want to talk about some of the elements of what makes for a thriving remote team that we can work together a lot more effectively moving forward. And then I also want to talk about the elephant in the room. My big belief actually is that when there's an elephant in the room, you should introduce them. And that is that over the last year, while we have seen some growing pains into a largely successful work from home experiment, we've seen a lot of burnout, we've seen a lot of distractions, and I want to give you some practical tools for keeping that at bay, both for yourself and for the people around you. So 2 big questions that I want to answer, and then we'll flip it to what questions you have and what specific situations that I might be able to speak into. So as we dive into those questions, I think the first one, let's start right off the top, which is what makes for a thriving remote team. Knowing that the future of work is working from anywhere, and that we're headed to a place with a lot more flexibility, I think it's worth asking this question. What builds a team that's working from anywhere, that's not always working in person, but might be some of the time, into a high performance team? And interestingly enough, there's a good amount of pre-pandemic research around what makes for thriving virtual teams. Probably the best conducted study of all time around thriving virtual or remote teams was conducted by Martine Haas and Mark Mortensen of a large multinational organization that had people forming virtual teams from all across the globe. So we didn't just have remote issues, we had time zone issues, we had cultural issues, we had all sorts of stuff. So like worst case, I shouldn't say worst case, but like hardest to build consensus around style of remote team. And what did they learn? And what they found is that the virtual teams that really thrived were teams that had 2 things in common. They were teams that established very early on 2 elements, what they called shared understanding and shared identity. They were teams that had developed as a team an understanding of each other, and we'll talk about this one a bit more in time to define it and give you some ideas for it, and an identity as a team. And this is why I said right off the top that it's not about how many employees work inside an organization or an association. It's about people working towards a project, because that's what builds shared identity, not just this idea that it's people who all get a paycheck from the same place. So I want to share with those definitions. I also want to share some practical ways that you can be working today. Later today, you could get started building shared understanding and shared identity. So to take them in turn, shared understanding quite simply is the extent to which members of a team share a commonly held perspective of the team's expertise, their knowledge, their skills, abilities, that assign tasks. Everybody knows who's responsible for what and what the deliverables are, the context, and also the work preferences. And particularly in a remote environment, I want to emphasize that context and preferences thing. You know, I can see it just by looking across some of the thumbnails of who was on camera, even as we were waiting to go. Everybody's coming at it from a little different place. Everybody's working in a little bit different context than has been for the last year. And understanding that matters a lot. I'm lucky enough, for example, to be coming at you from about a 10 by 10 room in the basement of my house. It's quiet. I've got a fast internet connection. My children are in-person school. And other people for the last year have pulled a folding screen across the corner of their dining room, and they're trying to hide from the children that are Zoom schooling, all while getting work done, right? A lot of people use virtual backgrounds because they think they're cool, and others use it because they don't want you to see the mess that is behind them. Everybody's working in that different context. And so building shared understanding is about that. It's not just about knowing who's working on what and whose strengths are what. It's also about understanding that context. So here's a couple ideas, a couple ways that a lot of thriving remote teams work to build shared understanding. Ideas that you could take if you're already doing, you could build upon them. And if not, they're ideas you may want to start trying to do today. The first is to share calendars. And I don't mean to open up your calendar so anybody can plan a meeting at any time. What I mean is that you have probably found your calendar is a bit different than the traditional Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. You've found a rhythm or a cadence to work over the last year that works for you, that people on your team need to know. If that means you're only putting in sort of morning hours, then taking the afternoon off, maybe you're in charge of helping Zoom school your children, or maybe you've just found that there's better times to get more focused work done. It's important to communicate that. Share calendars also means sharing time off, sharing time where you're going to be away, because otherwise that creates those late night, just before vacation emails you're trying to pack and you know you're actually trying to pull out for a day. The teams that know when each other is on and when each other is off have much better speed of communication, because people don't feel the need to communicate immediately. They communicate on those calendars. Everybody knows when they're going to communicate, and they get a better, more thoughtful response. So you need to do this for yourself, decide what your regular hours are, and we'll actually talk about that a bit later. But it's also worth saying as a team, or even a team of volunteers who are helping you out across, getting a sense of knowing exactly when people are in responsive mode and when they're in non-responsive mode goes a long way to building shared understanding. The next one, and this one is my number one activity to recommend to teams, especially teams that are all working for the same organization. But I think as you begin a long-term project, this is also a worthwhile activity to do, even if you have people from teams across multiple different organizations or industries or professions. And that is a team working agreement. And what a team working agreement is a way to put into writing what the norms of behavior on this team are going to be. In social psychology and organizational psychology, my background, we talk about this idea that teams go through a phase of storming, meaning feeling each other out and having all of this conflict over what the norms will eventually be, which is the next stage, norming, and then they finally go into performing. And what a working agreement does is it speeds that process by saying, what are our norms? And this is big and little. So this could be part of the shared calendars activity, but it could also be little things like what subjects are reasons for synchronous communication and what are reasons for asynchronous. In other words, a meeting. Or excuse me, synchronous being the meeting, asynchronous being an email, etc. But while we're on the asynchronous, what's a reasonable amount of time to reply to, let's say, an email, for example? Most people, when you ask them, say 24 hours, but come on, we all know those people who don't wait. They send you the email and 3 hours later, they're calling you asking if you read the email, right? So these are things that get hashed out in that working agreement. I actually like to think of a working agreement as a sort of declaration of interdependence. We start with a list of questions that acknowledge that we're going to succeed or fail as a team. And so we better figure out exactly how we're going to work as a team. Long term, I think these can become great documents not only for conflict resolution because we have the set norms of behavior, they can also be onboarding documents. So imagine joining a new team and being handed the user's manual, the owner's manual of how this best works with our team. So I highly recommend working agreements. The easiest thing to do here is just don't even call it a working agreement. Just start with a list of questions about how we want to manage this project ahead of time. What software, if any, do we want to use? How do we want to keep each other informed? What are our intervals of synchronous communication, and how do we want to stay connected out of that? All of those things work together, get put on paper in a shared document that people can reference to see those norms, and communication goes a whole lot smoother when we do. The third and final thing I'll say here is that I am a big fan of huddles, sometimes called the daily stand-up, sometimes called the team check-ins. But the idea here being that often we engage in projects that are longer term than are ideal for staying connected. And in the interim, what we need is a regular system. Could be daily, some teams do daily, could be weekly, could be every other week, could be even a month. The project really determines the interval of time where we check in and quite simply bring everybody up to date on what we're working on. You can make whatever questions a part of your huddle that you want. I usually say if you don't know what to do and you want to start implementing huddles, then default to 1 week, maybe 2, and default to 3 simple questions. What did I just complete? What am I working on now? And what's blocking my progress? And the third one is actually the most important question for the huddle. It's great to know what people have just completed. It's great to know what they're focused on now because that helps us eliminate any duplication of effort. That helps us know that every task is actually covered. But we found that in working with remote teams, a lot of times asking for help is something people refrain from doing. When we're in person, we can just walk down the hall or we can wait for that next in-person meeting to bring it up. But when we're in a remote environment, we often just think, well, I'll figure it out, so I better not bring it up. But if I have a regular check-in where it says what's blocking my progress and I have an opportunity to bring forth to the whole team, I need help here, I'm much more likely to do it. And other people are much more likely to volunteer and give us the resources, the time, the information that we need. So I'm a big fan of those 3 questions. What did I just work on? What am I working on now? And what's blocking my progress? As a form of a regular check-in so that the team is communicating. And if you've ever been a project manager, most of you have been, or you're leading the team, you know that in a remote context or in a context where people aren't meeting on a daily basis, often people give you this information, but they give it just to you. And then you end up having to be a conduit of it to all of the other people of the team. And that's what we're looking to avoid. Huddles do that because you make everybody be there at the same time. Everybody gets a chance to hear what everybody's doing. And so now it's a real team. It's not just 6 individual people all working and communicating back to you. What all 3 of these things have in common around shared understanding is that they're designed to make specific and deliberate what can often happen accidentally in an in-person environment. I mean, when you're all working the standard Monday through Friday from 8 to 5 or 9 to 5, then you don't necessarily need to share calendars. You can kind of rely on when people are going to be around. Whether you're in a co-located environment or remote environment, it's always a good idea to have things like working agreements, but they become much more important when you're in a situation where conflict doesn't resolve quickly. It can fester because you're not next to people, you're not near people, you don't have the benefit of in-person conversations to smooth things out. And the reason that huddles become a deliberate strategy to check in is obvious. When we're working together, it's a whole lot easier to have those conversations with people. But it's something that a lot of teams left at the office when they departed almost a year ago now. They forgot to create a deliberate system that will rebuild those check-ins. And so my encouragement would be don't start with all 3 of these. Start with one. Start with the one that resonated the most with your team or the one you're not doing. Or the one you are doing and build upon it a little bit more. But start with one and then gradually add those things a little bit more. Now that's shared understanding. We also need to talk about shared identity. Shared identity is the extent to which members of a team have the same sense of who they are as a group. They actually feel like a team. And I will tell you, in the last year, shared understanding was one of the biggest challenges most teams remotely faced. Little communication breakdowns, little forgetfulness around status updates, etc. But in 2021, I really think that shared identity is going to be the big problem. Some people are going to want to go back to a fully co-located environment. Some people are going to want flexibility, and some people don't want to come back at all, right? And what can happen there is that an us versus them between the co-locateds or the synchronized and the not so synchronized can develop. And we're used to this, right? I mean, we work in association life. We know we've worked in organizations. We know what silos, politics, and turf wars feels like. But I feel like this is a new opportunity to have those same issues crop up over who's around when. And without a strong sense of shared identity, that no, everybody working to tackle this issue, everybody working on this project is the team. It doesn't matter where they are. We can have a lot of things that break down over time. A lot of this is about building culture. A lot of this is about rebuilding times that used to happen in an in-person environment that now need to be much more deliberate. And so when you see these recommendations I have for you to try as a way to build shared identity, it won't come as a surprise. They're all designed to recreate that community that happened in the buffer times in our co-located work times. So the first is, it's actually one of my favorite recommendations to anybody, but it's called Fika. Fika is a Swedish word. It means to have coffee. It's quite simply, truthfully, that doesn't capture it. In Sweden, it's a ritual. It's a longer. The closest American equivalent might be when we used to say, "Oh, let's go get a drink after work." Fika is deeper than that. It's about connecting. It's about conversation. And what's interesting is even before Corona, BC, right before Corona, a lot of fully distributed companies had found that deliberately developing a Fika program or a regular coffee talk chat one-on-one time program where employees could opt into it, get randomized to get scheduled for a chat with somebody. A lot of them were already using it because they found it as a way to reconnect with individuals, to build that sense of identity, to build those bonds that would happen if you were co-located and you can see things like pictures of somebody's family, or you could see their diploma and know where they went to school and find out you are both alumni of the same school. All of that little information, that doesn't happen when we're jumping on a WebEx right at 11 a.m. and jumping off the call when it's over. We need to recreate that buffer time, and Fika is a way to do that. At a minimum, my recommendation is that if you are leading a team of people inside your chapter, you should make a plan as the leader to start having regular Fika, non-work conversations with everybody on the team. And if you're a chapter of one, then you should think about who the most important stakeholders in that chapter are, the people who are volunteering the most, etc., and make sure you're building that time to continue to build those bonds in. It doesn't have to be a fully systemized thing like what a lot of distributed companies do, but it does have to be something that's deliberate in your mind and on your calendar to reach out to people for these non-work conversations where we build bonds and build community over. It has to be something that's deliberate to you, otherwise it's really easy to forget about it. So Fika is one of my absolute favorites. Alongside that, I've used this term a bit before, is I've found that a really beneficial thing happens when we build buffer times into those meetings. I talked a couple minutes ago about the idea that in a remote world, people jump on the call right at 11 a.m. that's scheduled to go to 11:45, and boom, we're off the call. And nobody has that same chit chat on the way to the meeting, or if you arrive early and talk, nobody lingers the way they do in a conference room after the meeting's been dismissed. And as a result, nobody has that non-work interaction as much anymore. So as the leader, presumably if you're the one calling the meetings, make it a habit. Make it so that people know that if I schedule the meeting for a Monday at 11 a.m., I'm actually going to be on at 10:45. And if you want to interact and chat with me, I'm here. Ironically, that actually happened. Unintentionally, that actually happened today as part of this meeting. We came on for Tech Check 15 minutes earlier, but when we sent the WebEx update, it made it look like it was going on in progress, and several people got to reconnect with each other, talk about the vacations they were on, etc. It's proof that it happens. It doesn't have to be big, but proof that you're creating deliberately that space for non-work conversations around a regular work time meeting is all you need. That's all the space you need for people to self-disclose more about them. Let that reveal their preferences, personalities, histories, etc. And that's what actually builds bonds. Those uncommon commonalities between two people, they get found in the buffer times. And we need to be deliberate about building those buffer times back. And the last thing around team identity that I'm a big fan of is this idea of rituals. This idea that taking specific actions, behaviors, norms, sometimes even phrases or acronyms can become things that build an in-group bias towards the people who are all working together. Every organization has rituals. Some don't necessarily know they do, but even little things like jargon are kind of a form of ritual signaling who's in the know and who's not. And rituals really do build bonds. But most of the time, these little rituals, well, they're built accidentally. They're built from working co-located next to each other, from little habits or inside jokes that become regular rhythms. And we ought to be a little bit more deliberate about them in a remote environment because the opportunity to build them is a lot more seldom. So I've worked with remote teams over the last year that have developed rituals large and small, meaningful and relatively meaningless, but funny, right? So one team, for example, decided that what they wanted to do was create virtual backgrounds for every member of the team based on the organization's core values. And so what you would do is you'd have your virtual background, right over you, it would say bold or innovative or whatever the core value you wanted to choose for that day and focus for that meeting on was. You would get the opportunity to show that to the whole team, right? It's a fun little ritual around the core values. Other teams would do things like regular meals. One organization I worked with does a regular Taco Thursday. I have no idea why it's not Taco Tuesday. I mean, come on, it's obvious. But does a regular Taco Thursday, the first Thursday of every month, where everyone meets together for a virtual lunch. You go to your favorite local place to get food, then you jump on the Zoom call where you have a non-work hour-long discussion. But first you show the tacos that you picked, and everybody kind of bonds around preferences, etc. And it's once a month. It's not all that expensive. It's bring your BYOT, I guess, bring your own tacos. But the fact that it's there creates that time, and the fact that it's recurring makes it a ritual. Probably my absolute favorite is one organization I worked with developed the ritual of, instead of giving the applause button in their WebEx or their Zoom calls, they would do the silent clapping or the jazz hands motion, the silent clapping motion from American Sign Language to signal approval, which I have to tell you, when you're on a call and you're seeing the gallery of faces and suddenly all of them are moving around like this, it gets your attention a whole lot more than just the little applause emoji does. And the funniest thing was the time we were on a call with this one particular team that was doing it and a team that was not. And to watch the way the people on the team were doing it, smiling at each other, laughing at each other, and everybody who wasn't sort of slowly, gradually adopting it, you actually saw sort of two teams merge together over this ritual. Now, you don't have to do that one. If you think I'm silly and ridiculous, don't do it. But what you do have to do is think about, what rituals did we used to have that we can make virtual? Or what little habits, behaviors, inside jokes, or acronyms can we use as a ritual to signal we're one team? And then also, what can we do to build buffer times in between those meetings to help build that better sense of shared identity? Shared identity, remember, paired with shared understanding, is how we really take a remote team, a team that doesn't get the opportunity to meet in person all of the time, and make them feel like a real team, like an in-person team that gets together. What both of those things have in common is that they seek to be very deliberate about rebuilding the ways that we used to build teams in an in-person environment. All we're doing here, remember the idea of forming, storming, norming, and performing. All we're doing is being deliberate about how we get through the storming, how we settle the norming, and move forward into performing. And so if we focus first on building those ideas, building that culture, we can smooth out a lot of other issues about what technology we're going to use, how we're going to run specific, the agenda items on specific meetings, etc. If we nail that culture piece, a lot of the other issues, frustrations you may have had over the last year tend to resolve themselves, or at the very least tend to go through the system that we know will help resolve them because we wrote it in the working agreement, in our declaration of interdependence. We need each other, and so we need to come together about how we're going to build not only norms of working, but how we're going to build shared understanding and shared identity. Now, that's how we build a thriving team culture, how we build a thriving remote team. I want to talk about our own experiences for a bit, and also the experiences of other people on your team. This would be helpful to other people, but I find that when we talk about this next question, what can help keep burnout at bay? What can help keep us from overloading in this remote environment, I find that if we start with the leader first, then the team can actually kind of relax and follow those behaviors. And so most of what I'm going to share with you in the next couple of minutes is about you and about what you can do to stay more productive and survive. And again, this applies whether or not you've got a larger chapter of multiple different employees or whether you're a solo person, because this is about figuring out your own work rhythms and how you can make sure not to be overloaded. Interestingly enough, even before the pandemic, our BC again, before Corona, there was a wealth of research that suggested that working from home, working remotely, people were far more productive. But the reasons they were productive weren't exactly sustainable. And you've probably felt this over the last year. The reasons they were more productive is that they would start work when they used to start their commute. And they would work until the time they used to arrive home from their commute. And they would skip lunches more often and just eat lunch at the desk or take a much shorter lunch break. Or they would really, and this is where work from home becomes living at work, they would just blow up their calendar altogether and be responsive at all times. You know, we talk about this idea of not work-life balance, but work-life integration, but over-integration is a very real thing. If you're supposed to be interacting with your spouse or partner or your children or even just your friends or extended family, and you're actually typing out emails on your phone, you're not really present in either situation, but you end up stressed out in both situations. And so a lot of what keeps burnout at bay is about that. A lot of what can help us stay more productive is about building boundaries between different modes of our life and then also limiting distractions. Building boundaries and limiting distractions can make us more productive as an individual. And then as we adopt these rhythms, we can help the rest of our team to stay more productive as well. So there's an individual lesson here. And as I said, there's also a team lesson. So how do we build those boundaries? I think this is an important thing that a lot of people had to sort of stumble around in the dark to find when this great work from home experiment began. And some people now have nailed it, and other people other people just feel like they've been drilled into the ground and worn out. And the boundaries can be a lot of that reason. So my advice around building boundaries, and this is based on a lot of different research about what keeps everyone productive, but specifically work from home employees. The first would be set a schedule. And this ironically goes with our very first tip from building a thriving remote team and a team culture, which is sharing that schedule. But set a schedule. You don't have to resume normal business hours. You don't have to say, I work from Monday through Friday from 8 to 5. You've probably already figured out that that doesn't really work during a global pandemic, but it probably won't even work when things are back to normal or the new abnormal, whatever you want to call it. We, because we're working from home, have the ability to take a little bit more flexible arrangement. And the people who do better, but only if they create boundaries around those two times. And that only happens if we have a set schedule, not a reactive schedule. So that set schedule might be a couple hours in the morning, then a longer break, and then a few more hours in the afternoon or evening. That set schedule might be 8 to 5. That set schedule might be different every single day, but set it and commit to it just like you used to be committed to having to be in a physical location with other people all of the time. Just having that schedule and staying committed to it can help you mentally transition back and forth between work mode and home mode the same way that the commute or something like that used to. Now, if you're having a hard time with this set schedule because of sort of other people, I'll give you some advice on that in a little bit, but nothing happens until you actually set that schedule. So this would be where I start. The next thing, and this is probably even before the pandemic, I think is great advice, and that's to change devices when you change modes. In 2016, I published a book called Under New Management that profiled a number of different companies as one practice in the book that were banning internal email. And the reason, quite simply, one of the leaders who called for that, and I don't recommend you have to do that, but I love the rationale behind this, is he said everybody signed up for one of these smartphones. And then as soon as they did, everyone started taking their work home with them every single night. And so all the way back in 2015, when I was doing the research for that, I committed to a 2-device strategy to help myself draw some boundaries and not get too burned out. And so what I have is I have this, and I had to drag this from upstairs just to show you, but I also have a tablet that I keep upstairs when I'm done with work. And my change device is actually kind of an after work ritual too, is I'll go to the charging station in our house where our family keeps all of our devices and I'll switch them out. And the tablet has nothing work related on it. Doesn't have email, doesn't have any of my professional social media accounts, any of that. It's just Netflix and a Kindle and a private Facebook account that I use to interact with some close friends. And that's it. And I could always go over to the charging station and get my phone. I could, but that little bit of friction is enough to help me stay in the right mode and not draw me back to the other one. So changing devices when you change modes can be a huge way that you help build those boundaries. And if you don't want to get 2 devices, by the way, there's other tricks you can use. So for example, on your computer, you could just create 2 accounts. You could create, me at work and log out of that at the end of the day and log into me at not work and have different programs available to those different accounts. I found that 2 devices is easier than figuring out the software around changing accounts, but it is possible to do. And the last thing, probably the most important thing, and something I hope every one of you do right after this is completed, and who knows, maybe some of you are doing it from this, but is to get outside. One of the most consistent research findings around break times, restoration times, work rhythms, etc., is that nature breaks, outside, fresh air, in and around as much nature as you can find, are the most restorative breaks you can take. Whether it's walking around your neighborhood, walking around a park, or sometimes my get outside break is walking out on my deck and just looking, breathing some fresh air and looking because I can't go anywhere. If you can get outside into that, you will actually be amazed at how much more restorative that is than like walking to a different part of the house and watching a Saved by the Bell or Friends rerun or something like that. And in fact, if you don't believe me, that's actually okay. One of my favorite studies on the power of nature breaks shows that people consistently underestimated how restorative a walk around the park across the street from the building the study was conducted in would actually be. I mean, they literally had people guess how restorative would a nature break be, and then they asked them to do it, and then they measured how it actually was, and they found that people consistently thought the researchers were crazy, it wouldn't be all that great, and then came back saying, yeah, that was great, I feel great. So get outside, even if it's as little as 5-10 minutes, get into as much nature as you can find when you take your breaks. Don't just move to a different place in the house and plop down and just take a little rest time. Get outside and get a nature break as that most restorative break. Now, as I said, what all of these building boundaries have in common is similar to the culture piece. It's about rebuilding some of the natural boundaries that would happen when we worked and lived in 2 different places. With the exception of the get outside one, that's just always a great idea. And in the same vein of that are our ideas around how we limit distractions. Distractions in a remote work or a home working from home world are, well, they're a whole different flavor. I mean, let's be fair. Work was full of distractions too, but they're a whole different flavor because they bring with them senses of family obligations maybe, or senses of emergencies because it's our house that's pulling us, right? I mean, how many times have you been sort of deep in a project and then think, did I remember to turn off the oven? Or did I switch the laundry? And suddenly you're back up there, then you're distracted by something else. It takes you 30, 45 minutes to get back into that regular rhythm. Part of setting a schedule is so that you can be focused at work and focused when you're not at work, but you are going to need to develop some skills and help your people develop some skills on how to limit those distractions. So I'll give you a couple of those. The first is to add friction. This is sort of like my 2-device recommendation, or change devices when you change modes. Find a way to add a little bit of friction into when you're in work mode and when you're not. This could be setting up different spheres of the house. We did this deliberately. It's why I moved to the basement. I promise I'm not in trouble with the rest of the family. I just present from the basement because the walk down the stairs is sort of like a commute. It adds a little bit of friction. But I've also seen people add friction even in just changing clothes from work pajamas to home pajamas and back, right? Whatever it is that adds a little bit of friction or adds a little bit of an awareness, even if it's subconsciously, that you're switching modes, can help you stay focused when you're supposed to be in that mode. But it's not just adding friction in your own. You also need to be adding friction and actually blocking people from time to time. That means blocking home life and family life and friends life people away from work time and vice versa. The single most productive tool that I've had in the last 3 or 4 years, and I pulled it off the door to show you, is a $2.07 do not disturb sign that I hang on my door. And it took a while to train my 9-year-old and my 6-year-old, but we eventually arrived at a rhythm where if my door is open, come in anytime, ask me whatever question. If it's closed, knock first, ask me what you want, and I'll decide if I can be interrupted. And if the red do not disturb sign is on the door, turn around and go back upstairs. right? Unless your brother is bleeding or the house is on fire, turn around and go back upstairs. And I know that sounds mean, but here's the thing. The hardest part about training other family members was actually training myself, that I left the door open, and so I owe it to them to give them that time. So something you can do to signal not only to friends and family that you need to be focused on work, but also, by the way, this helps if you have multiple people working from home as well. Something you can do to signal to each other, those do not disturb signs, can be hugely beneficial. And it goes the other way as well. Finding ways to block people who are from your work sphere of life out of your life or your thought process when you're in a home or some other sphere of your life, that can be quite useful as well. That's where the team working agreements comes in, etc. But taking the time to actually do that, communicate that, and make sure people know when you're a part of them, that's actually the nicest thing you can do. Because as long as you're committed to being present with whoever you're with, they won't mind too much if you're blocking them out when you're in other modes. And the hope is that you establish that for them as well. For a lot of us who have been working, dual income families, etc., who've been working together in homes, this is something we've had to learn, right? And everybody is a little bit different. But as we develop these strategies to block people, you'll find that they keep you more focused on those same people when you're in the right mode with them. The last idea I have for you around limiting distractions is to batch your tasks. Now, this could be batch your tasks throughout the day. So maybe you're only responsive to email 2 or 3 times a day instead of entirely responsive. This could also be creating theme days. So, I'm an organizational psychologist by training, but I'm a writer by passion. And so I have dedicated writing days and dedicated reactive days so that I can actually focus on those tasks at a time. Other times it could be I batch those tasks and focus on what I would call, and Cal Newport uses the term, deep work at certain hours of the day and reactive work at other hours of the day. You decide what's good for you. That could be hours of the day. It could be specific days. I will tell you, one of the best things you can do for yourself is to pick a random day on the calendar every month as your untouchable day, meaning nothing gets scheduled on that day. That's your day to be focused on the deep work projects, the real projects that require uninterrupted focus. And just make sure you declare that at least one day a month. You have that untouchable, uninterruptible day where you can really focus in on all those tasks. Not only does it help you get those tasks done, but when the urgency of that task creeps in, it's actually helpful knowing, next Thursday is my untouchable day and I've got it scheduled for when I'm going to do that. It's not just about making sure the work gets done. It's about not feeling as stressed because there's a time on the calendar for the work to get done. And that's the beauty of that batching tasks idea. Now, you'll notice a pattern here with the limiting distractions. They're quite similar to the burnout at bay idea, which is that we're terrible at multitasking. Let's just admit it, we're terrible at multitasking. And so the more that we can make a little bit deliberate with the appropriate empathy to integrate work and life and then just stay on that track, the more we can keep burnout at bay. The way that I like to think about it is that there's not this sort of bliss state where we're not burned out and an overstressed state. Instead, staying productive, staying prolific, productive, staying healthy and not burned out, it's actually like walking a narrow road between building these boundaries and limiting those distractions. Those are the ditches on either side of the road. And our job is just stay on the road. And all 6 of these tactics, that's really the goal, is just that they help you stay on that road. And if you notice the overall pattern of everything we've talked about today, it's to be deliberate about the things that used to be accidental. Whether that's culture, whether that's burnout in your own productiveness, there are some advantages to a co-located workplace, but there's a lot of advantages to a work from anywhere workplace. Not only in opportunities to build the life that's more meaningful and more integrated for each other, but the ability to build teams from all over the world or from all different departments, professions, etc. The ability to build teams based on the needs of the project is a massive win too. But the hurdles that we have to overcome are how do we stay a lot more deliberate about building shared understanding, shared identity, about building times when we're in work mode and when we're in non-work mode. And a lot of us over the last year have been thinking, well, it's fine, I have it up here. But getting it down on paper, getting it down in a system that you share with other people is going to be much more effective. So we shared a bunch of different ideas. I'm actually keen to hear maybe in the chat which one was your favorite one as we move into a question time. But I want to encourage you before the end of our time together to pick one. Could be shared calendars, could be scheduling your first Fika, with one of your team members or one of the stakeholders that helps you serve your chapter. It could be buying a $2.07 red do not disturb sign on Amazon. It doesn't matter what it is. I want you to pick one and get committed to starting it by the end of today so that you can be on your way to building out these rhythms. I truly believe we're not going back to the way things were. We're going back to a much better place where the future of work is more flexibility, autonomy, and productivity. The future of work is working from anywhere. And I hope that the last 45 minutes that we spent together will help you develop the skills you need to lead from anywhere as well.